Yes, so this meeting will be recorded, and then let me introduce our speaker, Iryna Kuchma from EIFL, International Library Consortium. Iryna is an open access program manager, well-recognized expert on open access and open science. Iryna advocates for open access to research results, facilitates the development and implementation of open science policies and infrastructures, and provides support and training to library consortia in over 50 countries in Africa, Asia, and Europe. So Iryna serves on the board of numerous professional organizations, such as Confederation of Open Access Repositories, Global Sustainability Coalition for Open Science Services, and Director of Open Access Journals Council. So today, Iryna will share her experience on open science and open research. Iryna, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ildis, and it's a real pleasure to be here today and see colleagues and also meet new colleagues. So let me share my slides. And the topic which we outlined is a little bit longish because we wanted to cover why open research and open science is important, what are the approaches to making research more open, and then how libraries and research departments could drive change on the institutional level. So I suggest that I'll probably speak for about half an hour, and then we can have a conversation and discussion, because it's not a lecture, it's really a meeting where it would be very useful to share experiences. So I'll start from my context, and at the top you can see EIFL partner countries, and then at the bottom AMICAL partner countries. So in some cases we have similar partners, EIFL and AMICAL, but we also have some geographies where EIFL doesn't really work. So my experience will be mainly based on EIFL's work in Europe and in Africa, maybe not so much in Arab states and in Southeast Asia, because that's where we haven't really had a lot of open science projects, so I don't have a lot of experiences, so that's a caveat. Then I would also like to start with this flagship statement that was released earlier in February. And the context for it is that in the European Union, there is so-called European Union presidency, where one country drives discussion agenda for half a year. So Sweden started its presidency in January this year, and there was a meeting of ministers of science and research from all European Union member countries. And after this meeting, they confirmed that immediate open access should be default. And they did acknowledge that this open access is related to publications and also to research data management. So they acknowledge that there is still a room for improvement when we talk about accessing and reusing research data, and at least fair principles where data might not necessarily be open, but at least findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable to the extent possible should be a goal. And that's an activity where European Union wants to align with other countries in the world. And then open access and open science has been a priority for almost 20 years for the European Commission. And last year, EU presidency countries, France and Czech Republic also stress the importance of open science. And the reason they advocate for open access and open science, because it really contributes to high quality research. So there is a direct link between availability in the reusable way that could contribute to faster progress and better research. So they confirmed that immediate open access to peer-reviewed research should be a default. And they should also find ways how this immediate open access could be achieved without huge financial barriers, because they also stressed in this statement that they will be supporting open access journals that don't charge article processing charges and ensuring that there is no global divide. And then similarly, there was around same time, there was this article published about African context that there is also a growing momentum towards open science in Africa. And there are also some ongoing open science policy initiatives, for example, in Botswana, in South Africa. There are also some discussions in West Africa, in Ghana, and in Cote d'Ivoire. So it's really the right moment. And it's also the right moment because we can use UNESCO recommendation on open science. And over 180 governments of the world signed up to these recommendations and committed to implementing them. And it's now almost a requirement that ministries of foreign affairs receive before forthcoming UNESCO General Assemblies, where they have to report about the progress. And of course, these are not ministries of foreign affairs who report, they contact relevant ministries in their countries, ministries of education, science and research, or others. So that's another international policymaking instrument that could be used to drive discussions and change in the countries. And what is also important with UNESCO recommendation is that it provided a very inclusive definition of open science. Specifically stresses multilingual knowledge, which is important for our work. And it stresses this increase of collaborations and sharing for the benefits of science and society. And it also brings in indigenous and local knowledge creation. And that was an area that was a little bit overlooked in previous open science discussions. So it's also an attempt to incorporate indigenous knowledge, of course, following appropriate principles like care principle, authority to control, respect to local knowledge traditions. And it really summarizes what open science includes, that it's not only about opening up access to publications, it's also about open research data, open educational resources, open source software and source code, and open hardware. So usually when I have discussions about open science in universities, I follow this kind of script that you can see on the screen. So I try to present why open science is an issue that researchers should really try to practice, and then give some specific advice how open science could be practiced, depending on the career stage of a researcher I'm talking to, or depending on the discipline. Then what are institutional and funders' expectations? And in our areas, most of the funders really require open access now. And this requirement is, it's not about publishing in open access journals, but about making sure that a peer-reviewed research article is deposited in the repository, and it could be, it doesn't need to be a final publish a PDF. It could be an author-accepted manuscript, which is similar in terms of content to the published article, but looks slightly different in terms of formatting. And then how open science helps progressing with research career. And then I really focus on how open science is actually just science done right, how reproducibility and replication is really helpful for research activities, how open science really brings improvements on statistics, measurement, teaching, data sharing, code sharing, replication. And then I usually mention questionable research practices and how open science helps to solve this issue of practices, questionable practices. And then I try to focus on the tips, and I'm just showing plots as an example because that's an example of simple messages that there are 3 small actions that a researcher could take to give her next paper an extra boost. And these 3 steps are: deposit research data in a research repository, post a preprint, publish methods, and then there are explanations how to do that. So that's more or less a storyline that I try to keep when I talk to researchers about open science. But then, of course, there are these issues, especially when we talk to early career researchers, because obviously early career researchers would be most receptive to this idea of open science, but then they are also the ones who could be stuck with that if advisor won't be supporting the efforts of an early career researcher or a PhD student related to open science practices, or they might be afraid that it would be harder for them to publish their research, and their career really depends on that, and that they're also afraid that open science is so complicated that they might get something wrong and that their future career will be ruined. So I also try to answer these kind of questions in my talks and presentations. And I really like this article that I'm quoting here, and so on this slide. So it was, it's called A Guide for Graduate Students and Their Advisors on Easing Steps into Open Science. And this piece of advice is based on research workflow, where you start with concepts, then you design your study, analyze data, write a report, and then write an article. And then I try to give some tips on how open science could be practiced at each stage of this research life cycle. So the first one was to have a discussion, and this discussion could be with a supervisor, or it could be a discussion with colleagues who already practice in open science. And there is this movement which is called reproducibility team, where groups of researchers get together to discuss specific open science topics, and they have some scenarios how this discussion could be happening. And I know that in Asia, for example, there are a lot of this kind of reproducibility team discussions. And then for the rest of my talks about open science, I try to follow this project workflow, research project workflow, and address how open science really helps with organizing the folder structures, how document naming conventions really make it easier for researchers to do their research, but also for other researchers to reuse the research, why version control is important, how decisions about cloud storage could be taken, and then who has access to research results and when, either it is still in the process or after the research is done. And again, coming back to this research life cycle, a tip is to try to think about reuse perspective from the very beginning. So try to imagine a future self that would be looking at research results, and then it's really important when there is a clear structure, meaningful file names, and Open Science Framework is one of the tools that could be used to organize research process a little bit better on the project level. And I know that some universities, for example, in Hungary, some universities are even requiring PhD students, or strongly requesting the PhD students to use Open Science Framework as a framework for designing and storing and sharing their project work with supervisors or with other students, and it's a free tool. Then pre-registration is another topic that could be important when researchers start working on their projects, because that's a way for them to signal that they are starting their work. They will be researching on specific team that could be useful and important for other researchers, and it's also a way to find collaborators. For that, there is a simple pre-registration website, which is also offered by the Open Science Framework. And then moving on with research, some journals started publishing so-called registered reports, which is not a full article yet, but a report about interim results of the project. For example, opportunity to share study design and then get feedback from other colleagues and reviewers, or when there is a report after data analysis. So it's not a journal article yet, it's a preliminary report that could be shared to receive feedback. But this one is really discipline specific, because in every research you will have this kind of stages. And then, of course, preprints are a big topic now, and especially after COVID-19, we've all seen how preprints sharing really helped with getting tests and getting vaccines and treatment. And what was also surprising to me, I didn't know that nowadays time between submitting a journal article and publishing journal article, an average time, is longest ever. Somehow, I don't know, with all technological innovations, you would think that it should be faster, but it's really long. It really takes a lot of time to publish an article in a traditional journal, and that's why preprints really help, because they could disseminate research results in a timely manner, as we saw with COVID-19 research. And as we're seeing, journals are not minding when submitted manuscripts are also available as preprints. Just important to mention that at the journal submission stage. And preprints are also of good quality. There were a number of studies that confirmed that actually there are not so many significant differences between the content of preprint and a published article. Actually, 2/3 of those published articles are almost identical to preprints, so it's a good quality. But of course, those who are making preprints available, they should make those preprints available in a reasonable way and really clearly label them as not peer-reviewed research to make sure that media doesn't pick on them as final confirmed research results. But again, luckily we have clear guidelines on that, and they've been implemented by preprint servers. And then I usually show some examples of researchers who post preprints, and she's Marina Vyazovska, who is a researcher from Ukraine, and she received her Fields Medal last year. And in mathematics, the Fields Medal is an equivalent to the Nobel Prize, and she was actually the second female researcher who has ever received that prize. And she received it for the research that she first made available as a preprint on arXiv. And that research was so groundbreaking that other mathematicians started citing it almost the day after she posted this preprint. And it took her a year to publish this article in the Annals of Mathematics journal. But during that year, between her manuscript being available and an article published, other mathematicians were already using her research results. And then there was also a very useful statement last year from Coalition S, which is a group of funders who advocate for full open access, full and immediate open access to research results, where they said that journal independent peer review, like a peer review of preprints, which is going on in a number of initiatives, is of as high quality as journal dependent, journal-based peer review. So if a preprint has been peer reviewed, it's almost like a peer-reviewed journal article. For the Coalition S, there is really no difference. And then I show some examples how timely sharing of research was crucial for researchers, and how preprints posting help with that. So for example, this example, there were 2 articles that this researcher authored, and there was a need to cite both of those articles, like to refer in one article to refer to another, and both articles were still undergoing peer review in journals, and with preprints posting, they managed to get a citable DOI that they could include in the journal article. Was this example when this researcher's article was published, because when he posted his preprint on the preprint server by arXiv, then he received an invitation from a very good journal to publish this preprint as an article. And while the manuscript was reviewed by a journal, he received another invitation from another journal to publish that preprint. Of course, he didn't do it because he was already publishing with that first journal, but it shows that journal editors really go to preprint platforms. And it's also part of workflow for researchers in some disciplines. For example, researchers in high energy physics start their day with coffee and checking what's new on arXiv. So it's been embedded in the workflows of researchers and also journal publishers. And what I also wanted to show you, which is new, core Coalition of Open Access Repositories released this new directory of open access preprint repositories, and they could be browsed by alphabetically, and they could also be browsed by disciplines or by comparing characteristics. So it's a newly released tool that could be useful. Then, of course, research data management is a big topic, and here data management planning is important. And I think this data management planning should really be part of every researcher standard training. And again, luckily, there are many free and open data management planning tools that are already available, and it's really up to a researcher or to an institution to pick one of those and try to use it on the institutional level. And then when we talk about data openness, what's important to mention is that, of course, it would be ideal to have open data, but in some cases, unfortunately, it's not possible because of privacy issues or confidentiality issues or some other issues related to commercial contracts. And then data could be shared under specific conditions, for example, under data sharing agreements. And it's also important to admit that data could also be closed because of the reason I listed above. So there are different levels of openness, and then there are different stages of openness, so to say. And I really like to use this Tim Berners-Lee 5-star model. Tim Berners-Lee invented the web, and that was originally designed for the web, but then he repurposed it for data sharing, where he said that it's important to make stuff available on the web. It's important to make it available as structured data, and it would be good to use non-proprietary open formats for that. Then it would be good if it's shared via unique URL, for example, repository handle or DOI. And then it would be great if this data is linked to, for example, journal article that was a result of this data analysis, or workflows or protocols. And here we have this FAIR and CARE data principles that could be used to implement data sharing. And then, of course, when we talk about data sharing or even publications sharing, it's important to have good quality metadata, and that's where libraries come in, because they are experts in describing publications, and they could also give advice on describing data sets. And then especially when we talk about data sharing, it's also important to share documentation or maybe README files where there is some information available for people who would like to reuse the data. And then also it's an opportunity to bring in this software topic, because if specific software is needed to analyze the data, that could be also included in the information about data together with data depositing. So it's really, this data topic is a good topic also to stress the importance of open source software and open workflows that would be replicated. And then what's also important to mention, that is data sharing decisions should really be taken before the research starts, especially if data is collected from during interviews. If human subjects are involved, then they should really give consent to share personal data, or maybe a researcher could decide even not to collect any personal data if it's not so essential for the research results, because then it would be easier to make data available. And I mentioned journals before, and I would mention journals again, because I think it's also a common practice when a journal article is submitted, then a data availability statement is required. And if that research didn't generate any data, then that statement should be research didn't generate any data. But if the research described in the journal article generated some data, then journals would like to have some kind of access to that data if possible, maybe for the editorial team and for reviewers, or ideally for everyone who will be reading the article. So this data sharing topic is also something that is brought by and amplified by journals now. And when I need to show data policies of journals, I usually show this Open Research Europe, which is a publication platform for the European Commission, because I think they have a good outline, what they expect as open data, what could be exceptions to that open data, what is a data availability statement for the article. And then usually when you talk to people about data sharing, they are skeptical, because they might think that other researchers wouldn't really reuse their data, that it will take researchers some time to prepare data for sharing, but then it would be for no one, because no one is interested in the reuse. So we try to compile this case studies demonstrating that actually a lot of data is reused. And these case studies are from different disciplines, from humanities to sciences. And reproducible code and open research software is also important. Usually it's not something that libraries are heavily involved in. And I don't have a lot of expertise on this topic, so I usually just mention the importance of reproducible code and explain why open source is better than closed source, and how it is a part of sharing and collaborations culture, and then just give some links to guides that researchers could follow. And then, of course, open access publishing is a big topic. And I think here is important to mention that not all the journals charge article processing charges, because that's a common misconception. And of course, maybe the best ones, or the ones where a researcher wants to publish, do charge. But that's still, there are many others who don't. And I think what DOJ did, Directory of Open Access Journals, that they list journals without article processing charges on the homepage and let people filter those journals is a good tip for those who don't have access to funding. And then if a researcher decides to publish in a closed access journal, then there is always a way to make research available via repository. And in EIFL, we produce this guide explaining what is the version of the articles that would be deposited, how publishers don't really mind to have also accepted manuscript deposited, and why it's important for researchers to keep this also accepted manuscript. And I still receive a lot this question, is a repository same as a social network for researchers like ResearchGate, where a lot of researchers post their research results? And my colleague drafted a slide where she showed visibility of papers on ResearchGate versus visibility of papers in repositories, because repositories are really very well embedded in the web and scholarly content discovery systems. So with repositories, you can get a lot more visibility than with social networks. And it's still important to remind people that social networks are run by commercial companies and repositories are run by public institutions. And maybe the first effort should go into making research publicly available via public platforms. Another big topic is open peer review, and I think here is also important to stress that there are different flavors of open peer review, as there are different flavors of open science and open data or shared data. Some examples of openness could be when author and reviewer identities are known to each other, or when peer review reports are available and journals could practice one of them or all of them. And for me, again, this Open Research Europe is one of the examples of journal platforms that practice open peer review and explain the benefits of open peer review and how it works in practice when after editorial checks, an article is made available on the platform, but then it's made available as awaiting peer review. And then if there are peer review reports with recommendations for changes, those reports are available for everyone together with reviewers' names. And then authors prepare a new version of this paper explaining what has been amended, also publicly. And just wrapping up, what's important in this open science discussions is that it does take time, but then it also saves time later on. And a researcher could pick and choose one of the open science practices that they would like to have, and I think they will be receiving support from the community. So one of those recent examples is a new Nature Water journal, which was launched as an open access journal with very strong editorials that water science must be open science. Funders requires that in Europe, European Commission says that for them it's important that those who apply for funding know what open science is, and they have mandatory open science practices and also some recommended open science practices. And I didn't talk a lot about, well, I didn't talk at all about citizen science, because citizens and collaborative science is also one of the examples of open science practices. And there are disciplinary examples like this Open Climate campaign, where my organization is involved to amplify the importance of sharing of climate research and some actions that researchers who study climate change and biodiversity could do to practice open science. And it's really about enabling open science on the institutional level and then helping researchers to practice it easily and then make it normative, required or rewarded in terms of policies. And these are maybe the questions that I would like you to think about and maybe discuss what could be done in your institutions in terms of open science, what the obstacles are, and what could be the practices, like, I don't know, maybe library publishing, of course, repository support, and UNESCO offers a lot of support materials that could be used. For example, this checklist, how universities could be practicing open science, or European University Association has this open access checklist, how universities could support open access publishing with article processing charges and without, run repositories, and also help with policies. And my really last slide, sorry, is the importance of reforming research assessment, because if open science practices won't be rewarded by institutions, then they will probably won't be practiced as widely as they should be. And luckily in Europe, there is this coalition on reforming research assessment. I hope there will be some big developments in the coming days and months. So apologies for talking longer. I really practice, but you see, I went over time. Sorry about that, but we still have 15 minutes for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Iryna, for sharing all the current developments in open science domain, which turned out to be a lot, a lot of things going on. We are opening up for questions. Dear colleagues, if you have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, introduce yourself and your institution, and please ask your questions.
Maybe if you want to share your experience, if you're advancing open science on campus, and if there is a good story to tell, or I don't know, a bad story, and maybe for a bad story you could stop a recording if you don't want to share a bad story publicly.
We have a couple of questions in the chat here. Hasma would like to know, can we cite preprints? A question from students. I think preprints can be cited, can't they, Iryna?
Yes, they can be cited, but they are not peer-reviewed yet, and we still have this role of publishers to kind of accredit high-quality research via peer review.
There's a couple of questions here from Noor at Habib University in Karachi. He says, is it necessary to submit to publishers/journals after preprints are already shared? And then what is scoop protection and how does it work?
Well, when preprints started, there was this fear that a lot of research would be scooped. But then there was a survey that confirmed that 99% of authors, I think it's even more, 99 point something, didn't have any scooping problems, because if you want to steal, you would probably steal from some kind of obscure paper, not from something that is publicly available and could be checked, because like even when you want to resubmit someone else's paper to a journal as your paper, a journal will do similarity check, and they would notice that it's plagiarized from the content which is already openly available. So the scoop protection is actually this fact of making it available with clear descriptions that you as the author, here is a date stamp when you made it available, and with a DOI. And yes, I think we'll share the slides with everyone.
Iryna, can you please talk a little bit about ORCID and as a universal, this register instrument, because there are some others as research IDs that, different systems assign. So how does that work? Do they integrate between each other?
Yeah, you mentioned this importance of research in the context, and I think ORCID open author, open research and contributor ID is as important as DOIs, which is another type of persistent identifier for linking between, for example, published articles and data sets. And also if a researcher uses an ORCID ID, then it's almost like an online CV, which describes type of research that this researcher is doing, and that's very important for funding applications. It's also important for journals. I think many journals already integrated that in their manuscript submission workflows. And then it's also important, it also makes it easier for repository managers, because those of you who are using DSpace software, in DSpace 7, you have this functionality where instead of adding each author name, you can just copy and paste an ORCID ID and look up for correct name of this person, because many of us have this issue that our names are written differently in English and then in our languages, like even scripts are different. So it's important to point that Iryna Kuchma in English is the same as Iryna Kuchma in Arabic or Cyrillic, which will be spelled differently. So it's this interoperability layer which is important for the system. So I would say that it's a good practice to recommend researchers to register ORCID IDs and keep them up to date. I know that in some countries, ministries are even requiring that. It's great if you could have a national ORCID consortium and use all full functionalities that ORCID offer, like full integration for your institutional systems with ORCID. But even without this national membership, free ORCID APIs could be used by repository managers. And then there is this new, well, maybe not very new, relatively new ROR ID, which is an organization ID. And that's also something that publishers are starting requiring. When you are submitting your journal article, you don't write the name of your institution, but you add this ROR ID of your institution. And that's a big problem, because not every institution has this ROR ID. It's also free. It's easy to get it, but it's an effort. Someone in the institution should do it. And then inform every researcher that what that ROR ID is. But it would make it easier to get rid of the problems of names of institutions being spelled differently and then be not able to track all research outputs.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any last questions for Iryna this afternoon? Feel free to put your hand up with the reactions, raise hand, or put a question in the meeting chat.
If you have any challenges, then maybe we could also talk about that, because my talk was very positive, but it's not really an easy journey, and it takes, like I was showing, open access is a priority for European Commission for 20 years, and we're not really full way yet in Europe. So it's a long journey, but I think now is a good moment when a lot of things really sped up because of momentum created by funders, journal publishers, institutions. And I think it's also a challenge for libraries, because they need to reskill their staff, because I think ideally there should be at least one person in the library helping with supporting researchers on open access to publications, but also open research data. And I think open access to publications is a little bit easier than open research data, because with research data, you might need some disciplinary knowledge that not every librarian would have. How to encourage to publish? Yeah, I just had a presentation. Sorry, I'll read the question to everyone. How to encourage faculty to publish in institutional repositories? I think the only way to encourage is to really show the value. And I had another meeting yesterday when we were launching a new institutional repository in Botswana. And I was showing examples from other repositories, how research articles in repositories are really viewed and accessed a lot, because you can have access statistics. And if you could showcase that for your repository, number of views, number of downloads for articles, then those slides where I showed how discovery systems pick up content from repositories. Google Scholar, I was showing a slide where a paper was deposited in the repository, and then the next day it was already on Google Scholar, and a alert arrived to a librarian who signed up for Google Scholar alerts for her institution. And then it also potentially means more citations, and we usually show examples of articles deposited in the repository, and then how that article was cited over 100 times. So that's like a carrot. But then I think it's also important to have a stick in the form of a policy. So if you tell researchers that it's required, and especially if you link that to research assessment, and that's what many universities do. They say that if you want to apply for promotion, then don't send us all your papers, describe those papers in the repository, upload full text if you can, but if you can't, at least register metadata that you publish that article, and then just send us those links from repositories and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Iryna. There's another question here. Do you have data on which faculty choose open access? Is there an age factor here?
I think it's an age, and it's also a disciplinary difference. Like in physics, you don't really need to explain to researchers what a preprint is or why open science is important, because that's what they do from the outset. And maybe for humanities or for social sciences, it's a little bit more complicated. For social sciences, it's complicated because of a lot of personal data involved in the studies. But I think if we talk about open access to published journal articles, there shouldn't be disciplinary differences, because that's already published research. So there might be disciplinary differences when different disciplines really release their research results. Maybe not everyone is doing it as they go, but only after they have final results. But if it's already a published journal article, I don't see a reason why it can't be made available in an open access repository. And of course, publisher restrictions is one of the reasons, but then those publisher restrictions are related to publisher PDFs. And if we could convince researchers to keep also accepted manuscripts and follow publisher policies, like if a publisher says that also accepted manuscript could be made available 6 months after embargo period, I think 6 months after is better than nothing. Of course, ideally it should be made available immediately, but for that you need to have the right retention policy.
We have reached the end of our hour. and but there are still some questions coming in. So I just thought we could mention, if colleagues we'd just like to thank you so much, Iryna, for your presentation today. Colleagues who have to leave us. I just wanted to ask if you were willing to stay a bit longer to answer some questions, or if we should take this online, or what would you like to do? Take this offline, not online. Do you have time to stay for any longer?
I can stay, and I just answered.
Okay, yes, you did. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. But if you need to leave, please leave. But if you have more questions, then I think Iryna is here to stay for a bit longer. And we'd just like to thank you again for your time today and your presentation, which was full of really useful resources. I think the anecdotes in particular are really helpful to have when you're talking to faculty, so that you can have examples of things that have worked elsewhere. And it's really helpful as well for people who are starting out, but also people who've been in this space for a long time. But there's always new things to learn. There's always new policies coming out. There's always new approaches. So it's very, very helpful to have your perspective on this today, and I appreciate it so much.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, and there is no really wrong approach. Like even every small step towards openness is important and meaningful. So I think that's also a message to keep, that people shouldn't be afraid to start, and of course that should be within copyright and legal framework. And again, luckily, we don't need to advocate for copyright changes when we talk about open access, because we can use existing tools to enable access.
There is an interesting, theme that Hasmik is raising in the chat about restrictive publishers agreements. So can you speak a little bit about that, Iryna? What should be aware of, before we go into these agreements?
Yeah, I think it's important to check publishers' policies when content is deposited in the repository, and if those policies are restrictive, then unfortunately we have to follow them. But then there are also ways how a certain compromise could be achieved. So maybe if a publisher doesn't allow publish a PDF or also accepted manuscript to be available in the repository, although I don't think any publisher really restricts availability of also accepted manuscripts. Maybe there is an embargo period, but at some point it could be available. Then making a preprint available in a repository could be an option, of course, clearly indicating that it's a preprint and then link to the journal article. And maybe this message about linking back to the journal article is important, that even when it's also accepted manuscript that is deposited in the repository, in the metadata, there should be information about published article and the DOI of the published article. And some publishers are confused, and that's why they have complicated policies. Some publishers have their agenda, and that's why they have complicated policies. But I think we have strong messages now from funders and from university associations that open access is a way to go, and we need to find ways how that could be advanced globally, but also on the regional level and national and institutional level.
Okay, thank you. There was a question about director of open access journals, whether there are any predatory journals or how do they check, and I think you all answered that.
Yes,
so they have this checking policy.
Mm-hmm. So first they really check when a journal is being added, and then they do periodic auditing of content. And maybe here it's important to stress that there is a difference between predatory journals and low quality journals, because predatory journals are actually the ones that don't do any peer review, and they just want to grab money that authors pay during submission or during publishing. But then there are a lot of journals where it's really hard to assess the quality because they might be very disciplinary specific, and DOJ is doing a lot of very rigorous checks to ensure that only high quality journals are added. But then this notion of quality is also very blurry, because we see that even Science and Nature publish a lot of retractions, because even for the top journals, it's really hard to assess the quality of novel research. So I think that's something that we have to accept, that some discoveries might be good at their point of time, but then there will be new discoveries that would contradict to those ones, and then an article could be retracted, or it could be a simple mistake in a spreadsheet that would lead to not correct results, and that's another reason to retract an article. And again, even the best journals are retracting for that reason, and that's the reason why journals started asking for data and really checking whether spreadsheets are correct. Yeah, and I agree that well-developed institutional policies will be of great use. I agree that it's really, it's all in the institutional hands, and libraries could assist with that. If you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Oh yeah. Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, glad to see you, Iryna. I have a short question. Whom would you advise to approach? What unit of the university to develop institutional policy? Otherwise, despite several meetings with faculty and promoting our open access repository, we don't feel so comfortable and confident to publish institutional repositories. I think this should be done on high level with university administration or certain units. I don't know. If we have a policy, then I think we will achieve much more better results. What unit, institutional research office or roles, I don't know. What will be our steps?
So I think it would be good to talk to the person in the university who is responsible for research. So it could be vice rector for research, or it could be directorate for research. It really depends on the university structure, and try to convince that person that it's important. And again, for Armenia, good news is that the ministry is developing an open science strategy, and will make it available very soon. So then maybe you can refer to this national strategy, or say why open science is a timely topic to discuss. And then maybe if a working group could be created with a representative of university administration, the library, research departments, maybe graduate student department, and this working group could work on a policy, and then faculties could be brought in when there is a consultation process.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you, Iryna, for answering all these questions and for sharing your experience. So it's a lot of useful information, and yes, we all started with open access, and then with open science, which has many more aspects, and each plays an important role in this open science universe. So any last minute questions, colleagues?
Maybe also
Otherwise, I think, yes.
one more point that with open science, like when you talk about research data, you don't really have to deal with other stakeholders like publishers at the moment, because research data belongs to researchers. So maybe it's an easier way to convince researchers that openness is important when you start with data where you don't have publisher restrictions, and then you can bring in open access to publications topics. And thanks a lot for the invitation, the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Iryna. Thank you, dear colleagues, for joining us today. To discuss this very important topic, and for sharing your experiences and for raising your questions.